They said the Dalton land was silent now. But if you go there after rain, when the soil turns black and heavy, you can still see where the graves once sank. Small depressions in the earth, too shallow for cattle, too deliberate for erosion. Beneath them, the bones of a family the state once declared cleansed. It began with a scream that no one recorded. A woman's voice muffled beneath a barn floor, rising through the slats and carried by wind across empty cornfields. The neighbors thought it was an animal, but those who heard it up close, the mail carrier, the boy from the next farm over, said it wasn't an animal at all. It was a prayer being torn apart mid-sentence. By morning, smoke hung over the Dalton farm like a bruise in the sky. Chickens wandered loose, doors were open, and the family's church, a narrow, windowless building they'd built with their own hands, was nothing but ash and nails. No one came forward to claim the bodies. No one ever did. But beneath the ruin, there was something else, something that survived the fire. A photograph. 11 figures standing in front of the church before it burned. 3 of their faces crossed out in thick black ink. No note, no date. Just eyes that seemed to follow the light, no matter where you stood. Which city are you watching from? And what time is it right now? If you were to stand in that field at midnight, you might feel the ground pulse beneath your shoes. Faint, rhythmic, like the echo of a buried heartbeat. The old farmers say it's the pipes from the new subdivision. The ones who remember the Daltons say otherwise. They say it's the sound of a bloodline refusing to die. The records list them as farmers. But even then, people whispered that something wasn't right. Their crops grew taller than anyone else's. Their children didn't play with the others. And their doors, every single one, had iron nails driven into the frames from top to bottom, as if to keep something inside. No one dared ask what, not in 1928, because in Grant County, silence was a form of survival. The Dalton property lay 3 miles outside Jonesboro, Indiana, a quiet stretch of farmland hemmed in by oak woods and cattail swamps. On old maps, the borders are drawn in faded red ink. Dalton Tract, Est. 1872, but the soil there had been tilled long before the Daltons arrived. The natives called it the place that hums. They said the ground had memory. When Samuel and Ruth Dalton bought it, they built their house facing east toward the rising sun and planted a white oak in the front yard. For years, the land seemed to bless them. The harvests were plentiful, and not one of their cattle ever took sick. But the neighbors said they worked too hard, stayed up too late. There were lanterns burning in their windows long after midnight, and sometimes the faint rhythm of hymns, or what sounded like hymns, drifted across the fields. By 1900, there were 18 Daltons spread across 3 houses. They built their own church at the edge of the property. They didn't call it Methodist or Baptist or anything else. They called it the Church of the Redeemed. No steeple, no bell, just a narrow structure of raw pine. Its door marked with a carved symbol that no one outside the family recognized. When the local minister came to offer a blessing, they turned him away. He wrote in his journal that the eldest son, Jacob, had eyes like glass filled with something living inside. From then on, the Dalton land grew quiet. The family buried their own dead, baptized their own children, and began what one doctor would later describe as a private gospel of isolation. In the winter of 1927, the first letters arrived from the State Health Board. The state was conducting a rural health initiative. Routine screenings, nothing more. But the Daltons refused. When the second letter came, they still refused. By the time the doctor from Marion arrived unannounced, It was already too late for them to say no. The doctor's name was Ellsworth Graves, and what he saw inside that house would follow him for the rest of his life. Dr. Ellsworth Graves arrived just after dawn. His report, filed weeks later, said the Dalton farm smelled faintly of lye and wet wood. The family had gathered to meet him in silence, 11 of them in total, their faces pale and blank like paper left too long in the sun. He found the children first. They stood in a line against the far wall of the kitchen, their hands clasped, their eyes dull but unblinking. One boy, maybe 10, tilted his head as Graves approached, as though listening to something in the walls. When the doctor knelt to examine him, the boy whispered, "Don't open the cellar. They're not done sleeping." Graves thought he'd misheard. But then he noticed the trapdoor behind the stove, its hinges sealed with tar, a cross scratched into the boards. The air down there was colder than the house above, and it carried the faint, chemical scent of something preserved. He made notes, clinical, detached, but his handwriting faltered when describing the children's features. "Signs of deformity," he wrote, "inbreeding suspected, faces too similar, one girl approximately 8, exhibits profound developmental delay, but recites scripture flawlessly in Latin. None of them had ever attended school. None could explain where they had learned." Ruth Dalton had been dead for 25 years by then. Samuel was gone too. The family's patriarch was Jacob, thin, grey, his hands trembling as though the bones inside were hollow. He insisted that they were blessed, that their bloodline was chosen. He spoke of a covenant, a promise made generations ago. To keep the family whole, Graves left that evening under the pretense of returning for follow-up examinations. In his carriage, he wrote a single line that was later found in his private notebook. The Daltons believed themselves purified through flesh. 3 weeks later, his official report reached the Indiana State Board of Health. It was stamped, confidential, and buried in the archives for nearly 70 years. But the language was unmistakable. Hereditary degeneracy, moral collapse, biological contamination. By the state's standards of 1927, the Daltons were not just a family. They were a contagion. By spring, the state had made its decision. On April 2, 1928, 2 black Model Ts rolled down the dirt road toward the Dalton property. Inside were 3 officials from the Board of Health and a deputy from the county sheriff's office. Their orders were simple: remove the children, document the adults, and quarantine the property for inspection. No one from those cars was ever seen again. At first, the state assumed they'd fled, stolen county equipment, abandoned their posts. But a week later, when a search team finally braved the Dalton farm, they found one of the vehicles half submerged in the marsh behind the house. The doors were open. The driver's seat was empty. The floorboard was soaked through with blood. The report that followed, unsigned, undated, was short. Premises found abandoned. Possible fire. Structures unsafe for entry. Recommend total demolition. And that should have been the end of the Dalton family story. But 5 days after the official closure, the mailman on Route 6 received a letter postmarked from Jonesboro. No return address, no signature. Inside was a single photograph, the same one the investigators had found years later under the ashes. 11 figures, standing in front of the church. But this version was different. The 3 faces that had been blacked out before were now clear. Instead, 3 others had been crossed out. Someone had taken that picture again. The handwriting on the back read, "We are not gone. We are waiting. For decades." The Dalton name vanished from public record. The land was parceled off to a paper company, and the ruins of the house were leveled. But the foundations, the cellar stones, were never removed. Workers refused to go near them. One of them, a man named Henry Cross, later told his wife he heard voices down there. Not cries, not laughter, just murmurs, like a family praying together through the soil. When asked what they were saying, he couldn't remember the words, only the rhythm, a slow, steady chant, a name repeated until it lost all meaning. Dalton. When the land was sold, it was renamed Oak Hollow Tract, though locals still called it the Dalton Place. Nothing grew right there anymore. The grass yellowed early. The creek turned the color of rust after rain. Even birds avoided the trees near the old foundation stones. In 1953, a man named Reverend Paul Merrin bought the property for a spiritual retreat. He believed the ground could be redeemed through prayer. He built cabins for his followers, cleared what remained of the Dalton barn, and raised a new cross in the field. On the first night, as the congregation prayed, the generator failed. The darkness that followed wasn't ordinary. It was thick, almost physical, as if the air had been packed with soot. And then came the sound, a hollow knocking from beneath the earth, rhythmic and deliberate, as though from far below. Reverend Merrin ordered everyone inside, but a teenage girl named Elsie stayed behind. She said she saw lanterns, 3 of them, moving through the fog at the tree line, heading toward the ruins. Each light bobbed with the slow, steady pace of someone walking barefoot through mud. The next morning, the field was marked. 11 impressions in the soil, each about the length of a body. At their head, a wooden post had been driven deep into the ground. A message carved into it read, "Do not divide what was made whole." Within a month, half the retreat members had left. The others stayed, convinced the disturbance was spiritual, a test of faith. Reverend Merrin performed nightly vigils, reciting from scripture, sprinkling salt in circles around the cabins. But every dawn, the lines in the soil reappeared, no matter how often they were erased. On the 7th night, Merrin went down to the cellar, alone. He carried a Bible and a lantern. His wife later said she heard him praying aloud through the floorboards, his voice trembling but resolute, until it stopped mid-sentence. When she finally opened the trapdoor, the lantern was still burning at the bottom of the stairs. But the Reverend was gone. What remained was his Bible, open to a single verse he had underlined so hard the page tore. "And those who bind themselves by blood shall not be loosed until the earth gives back the names it swallowed." They sealed the cellar after that, nailed it shut with iron spikes, the same way the Daltons had done. The few who stayed on at Oak Hollow swore they heard movement below the boards at night. Soft shuffling, a drag like cloth being pulled over stone. When the wind shifted, the air through the cracks smelled faintly of brine, though the nearest sea was hundreds of miles away. The Merrin family abandoned the land in 1954. It sat untouched for nearly 20 years, until a survey crew from Grant County, Historical Preservation, arrived to document it. They found almost nothing left of the Dalton era, just fragments of burnt timber, corroded nails, and the foundation stones half swallowed by the woods. But one of the crew, a young archivist named Leo O'Connor, discovered something wedged between the stones, a stack of papers wrapped in oilcloth, blackened by moisture, but still legible. They were written in a careful, archaic script, each page signed by Jacob Dalton. The letters weren't addressed to anyone. They read more like confessions, entries in a secret scripture. He wrote of a blood covenant older than man's law, and of a sickness that visited the family whenever one of their own married outside the bloodline. "It is not deformity," he wrote. "It is memory returning to the flesh. Each child carries a shape older than bone. We do not die, we diminish." One passage described a ritual held every 7th spring, an offering of silence, of breath withheld underground, to ensure the blood stayed awake. The details were vague, half poetic. But one line stood clear even through the damage. "If ever the line breaks, the earth will open to gather what is hers." Leah took the letters to Indianapolis for study. Within a month, she stopped answering calls. Her apartment was found empty. Her car parked outside, as though she'd only stepped out for a moment. The only clue was the notebook on her desk. Its final page scrawled in shaking pencil, "They still know their names. They still know mine." After her disappearance, the Dalton papers were sealed again. The historical board labeled them non-essential folklore. But somewhere in the archives, behind a false drawer, a single photograph remains, 11 figures, all faces crossed out, except one. The photograph resurfaced in 1979. It arrived at the Marion Public Library in an unmarked envelope, addressed simply to the keeper of records. The librarian who opened it, an elderly man named Harold Finch, recognized the Dalton name immediately. He'd grown up hearing the stories whispered by his grandmother, who'd once picked corn beside their fields. At first glance, the image was ordinary, 11 people posed stiffly before a white clapboard church. But under the library's fluorescent light, Harold saw that the photo's surface was wrong. It wasn't printed on normal paper. It shimmered faintly, as if coated with a thin layer of oil. And though the image seemed still, the faces, those that weren't crossed out, appeared slightly different each time he looked. That night, the library's janitor found Harold in the basement archives, sitting perfectly still in his chair. The photo lay in front of him. His eyes were open but glazed, his lips slightly parted as if in mid-prayer. When they took him away, the only words he managed were a whisper. "They're closer than the ground." The photograph was sent for forensic analysis, but before it could be processed, the envelope and all its contents vanished from the evidence locker. The following morning, a set of wet footprints was found leading from the locker door to the stairwell. Bare footprints, 11 of them. That same week, a small sinkhole opened on the outskirts of Jonesboro, right where the Dalton property had once stood. Locals claimed it smelled like rain and iron. Beneath the collapse, they found remnants of the church's foundation and bones arranged in a circle, each skull facing inward. The sheriff sealed the site and forbade excavation. But one deputy, curious, returned after hours with a lantern. He descended only a few feet before the ground beneath him began to tremble, faint but constant, as if something vast shifted below the clay. He dropped the light and fled. By morning, the sinkhole had filled itself. Smooth, packed earth, as though nothing had ever broken it open. That was the last official mention of the Daltons in any county record. But in Jonesboro, people still talk about the hum, a low vibration that comes from the ground during storms, rising and falling like breath. They say if you press your ear to the soil long enough, you can hear the voices counting, not years, not prayers, names. By the turn of the millennium, the Dalton story had slipped into rumor, an Appalachian ghost tale told around campfires and half believed by those who still remembered the smell of that soil. But every few years the story stirred again, as though something beneath it refused to stay buried. In 2003, a development company out of Indianapolis purchased the land. They called it Dalton Estates, though the name was meant ironically, an attempt to domesticate the legend. The plan was to build 24 suburban homes. The blueprints showed Cull D. Sacks where the church once stood, playgrounds where the barn had burned, a walking trail where the cellar had been sealed. Construction began in spring. Within a week, 2 workers quit. One said the air changed when the machines cut into the old soil, dense, wet, metallic. Another swore the excavator stalled every time it crossed a certain invisible line in the field. Even though the engine was new, on the 9th day, a trench collapsed. The foreman, Caleb Wren, was inside. His crew dug him out within minutes, but he was already gone. No wounds, no crushed bones. His mouth, however, was full of dirt, packed tight between his teeth as though someone had fed it to him. Work stopped. The company tried to write it off as an accident, but the equipment logs told another story. All machinery within 20 feet of the collapse had recorded unexplained vibrations at 2.3 Hz, too slow to be seismic, too precise to be random. When a geologist was brought in to survey the property, she found no natural explanation. Her report noted something strange: subsurface resonance, patterned intervals consistent with rhythmic movement. In simpler words, the ground was breathing. That night, the geologist, Dr. Lane, stayed in her trailer at the site. Around 300 a.m., her radio came alive with static, forming faint syllables between the noise. A child's voice whispered her name. Then another followed, and another. 11 voices in total, each one softer, slower, closer. By morning, her trailer was empty. The floor showed 11 footprints in mud, all leading inward, none leading out. After that, Dalton Estates was abandoned. The investors pulled funding, the permits expired, and the land was left fenced off, condemned. No one came back. But the wind still carries something when it crosses that field. A low chant, barely audible, like words spoken from under the ground. A single phrase, repeated endlessly, as though waiting for someone to answer. The line is not broken. The winter came early that year. The first snow fell before November, muffling the world around the Dalton tract, until even the wind seemed hesitant to pass over it. From the highway, the land looked harmless now, just a patch of fenced earth, pale and sleeping. But those who lived nearby said the snow there never stayed white. By morning, it turned the color of ash. In 2011, a pair of graduate students from Purdue University, Aaron Hale and Mira Cates, came to Jonesboro to finish a thesis on rural genealogical anomalies. They'd stumbled across fragments of Dr. Graves's original 1927 report, mislabeled in the state archives. When they read it, they thought they'd found a forgotten chapter of eugenics history. They didn't know it was something older. They arrived with recorders, soil sensors, and a ground-penetrating radar unit. On their first night, they set up camp beside what used to be the Dalton cellar. The radar flickered constantly, registering movement beneath the frost. Not animals, patterns, shapes. 11 in total, arranged in a ring. Mira wanted to dig. Aaron refused. He said the ground wasn't cold enough. It gave off heat through the snow. They argued until midnight. That was when the sound began, a faint humming from below, rhythmic and synchronized with the flicker of their lantern. When Aaron knelt to listen, the frozen earth trembled under his palm-like skin. The recording from that night still exists. Discovered years later in the archive of their university's anthropology department. For 34 minutes, there's only static. Then, faintly, a man's voice, Aaron's saying, "They're not gone. They've learned how to move through memory." After that, the sound of shovels. Then screaming. Then nothing. Authorities found the camp 2 days later. The tent was half collapsed. Their equipment was gone. The snow had melted in a perfect circle around the spot where they'd stood. And in the center of that circle, the dirt had risen into small, uneven mounds, 11 of them. Each mound was marked by a single object taken from the living: a notebook, a ring, a fragment of cloth. And carved into the frozen ground beneath, a message written in block letters, unmistakable even through the frost: THB load remembrs. Since then, no one has tried to build on the Dalton land again. The county calls it unsafe, but that's not why the fences remain. The locals know. They still hear the hum at night when the rain turns to sleet. They know what it means. The Daltons never left. They were never buried. They were absorbed. The line was not broken. It simply went deeper.